Hey, welcome back. Like you said, my name's Austin. If we haven't met yet, hey, good to see you guys. Hey, usually David and Andrew are the ones who get up here and preach the Bible from week to week, but that can be a lot. If you didn't know, we have services on Thursdays for Salt Company and Sunday. So a lot of preaching goes on in our church. So every now and again, I'm happy to just kind of get up and help them out, give them a break a little bit. Well, we kind of got to get moving this morning because we have a lot of ground to cover. We actually had Bryce just read like the back half of our text this morning. We're actually going to start in Matthew 22:15, and we'll go all the way to verse 46. But fair warning, all right? They gave the music guy, me, the text about 4 things: taxes, the afterlife, the greatest moral question in the universe, and the identity of the Messiah. All right, so lots of stuff to cover. I don't know why they gave me this passage, but they did. Here we go, buckle up. It's gonna be fun. But before we get into it, I wanna call your attention to something. If you haven't noticed it yet, the stories that we've been walking through over the last couple of weeks and the one we're in this morning, they all take place in the very last week of Jesus' life. And in particular, this morning, our story takes place on Tuesday of the last week of his life. So he's got today, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then what happens on Friday? Very good, Sunday school people. He's crucified. And it is abundantly clear that Jesus knows that's going to happen. He's even told his disciples this over and over again, like, hey, when we walk into Jerusalem, I'm going to be hated. They're not going to like me. And eventually, they're going to hate me so much that they're going to have me crucified. But then, like David was talking about, I'm going to rise again from the grave. So let me ask you a question. If anybody at all knows that they're going to die in less than a week, wouldn't what they choose to do, say, how they choose to live, wouldn't that say a lot about who they are? I think that'd be true for most anybody, but it would especially be true for Jesus. So why do I bring this up? Well, if there's a time for us to really lean in, it's now. If there's a time for us to really start paying attention to what Jesus is saying and doing, it's right now. If we say that we believe that this man Jesus is who he really is, if we say that we want to know this man Jesus, it's time to lean in, because what he does in the last week of his life will say a lot about who he really is. So the question is, if Jesus knows that he's going to die on Friday, what does he do on Tuesday? Well, the surprising answer is he spends a lot of time with people that hate him and want to kill him. Anybody else want to do that with their last week of life? No, we want to do things like we want to spend time with family. Maybe some of us want to go jump out of an airplane or something. I don't know. But this is exactly what Jesus does. He spends a lot of time with people that hate him and want to kill him. He leans into them continuously. And the irony of this is that the vast majority of the people that wanted him dead were the people that claimed to know God. This morning, we're going to look at 4 encounters that Jesus had with these people that claimed to know God, yet wanted Jesus dead. There's the Pharisees. You probably know about them. We've been covering them quite a bit. There's the Sadducees, and there's a little guest appearance by this kind of more political group called the Herodians. But what every single one of them have in common that we'll see is that all of them will have to dramatically change their way of life if, in fact, Jesus is who he says he is. If Jesus is the Messiah, then the Pharisees can't be the Pharisees anymore. The Sadducees can no longer be the Sadducees, and the Herodians can no longer be the Herodians. All of them must now become the Christians. And they know this. And that is something they are just not willing to do. If the Christ has truly arrived, and this man standing before them, Jesus, is truly him, then something fundamental about who they believe they are and how they live their lives has to change. And I wonder if when we're faced with this reality of who Jesus is, I wonder if there's someone here this morning that might realize the same thing. I wonder if you might realize that if you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, And something about the way that you view yourself and the way that you live your life might need to change too. These three groups of people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians, see, they know that if Jesus is who he says he is, they got to change. But the problem is they don't want to change. They would rather stay who they are. Let me paint a picture for you. There's a potter, and Jesus is that potter, and he walks into his shop, and like a potter does, he wants to sit down and start shaping his clay. But when he sits down, what he finds is instead of his clay being ready to be shaped, instead of his clay being soft, he finds that the clay is dry and hard, and it will not budge. The religious leaders are the hard clay. Instead of being like soft clay that's ready to be shaped and molded by the potter, they will not allow the potter, Jesus, to come and shape them into something that they don't want to be. They will not let it happen. So what are they going to do? Well, they have a very interesting strategy. They're going to ask Jesus carefully designed and well thought out questions. But the questions they're going to ask him are not designed in such a way that they actually want like answers from Jesus because they're curious. They actually design these questions to test him. They want to ask these questions in such a way that no matter how Jesus answers, he'll be discredited as the Christ. So let's look at what happens. Look at verse 15 in Matthew 22. It says, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully. And you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?' But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, 'Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax.' And they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is this?' They said, 'Caesar's.' Then he said to them, 'Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away." This is an incredibly well-designed and organized trap of a question. First off, did you notice the tone with which they approached Jesus? "Oh, great and wonderful teacher, you are so great. You don't care about what anyone else thinks. We know that you're true. Tell us, oh, great and wonderful teacher Jesus, what do you think? Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not?" They pretend to approach Jesus and ask their question with a sincere heart. But the question they ask Jesus is anything but sincere. They asked Jesus a question that would have been incredibly controversial and divisive. It's a political question. And the question isn't really about taxes in general, but they're asking Jesus about a very specific kind of tax. And the tax was just one denarius. That tax was called the poll tax. And one denarius really isn't that much money, right? One denarius is basically just like what you would be paid in this time, in this age, if you worked for one day. So the money was not really the problem. The problem was that the poll tax was symbolic. Every single person in the Roman Empire was required to pay this tax as a way of saying, "I submit to the rule of Caesar." And to understand why this is such a problem, I actually want to show you the coin that Jesus would have used for this illustration. So I've actually got a picture you see on the screen. We actually have these today. So it's one of the things in the Bible that we can still hold in our hands and look at. So this is a silver Roman denarius. And on the front of the back of the coin are images of the emperor at the time, Tiberius Caesar. And remember, after they give Jesus this coin, he asks them a question. He says, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" So they say, "Well, Caesar's, obviously." But remember, he doesn't just ask them whose image is on the coin. What else does he ask him? He says, "What is the inscription on the coin?" In other words, what does it say? And if you look, I've kind of translated it for you. On the left side, the front of the coin, it says Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Or in other words, Tiberius, son of God. And if you look at the back, it says Pontifex Maximus, or in other words, high priest. Can you imagine, can you see why the Jews might have a little bit of a problem with this? This is why the question they asked Jesus is such a trap. If Jesus says, yeah, you should pay this tax, you should give this coin to Caesar, you should say that you submit to him, who does that get him in trouble with? The Jews. Not only would he drive many of the Jews to anger, but he would actually be discredited to a lot of them as a trustworthy Jewish leader. But on the other hand, if he says, no, you shouldn't pay this tax to Caesar, who does that get him in trouble with? Caesar himself, the Romans, and everyone who supports them, including the Herodians. Remember, the Pharisees approached Jesus, they sent their disciples, but they also sent the Herodians, the followers of King Herod. And King Herod was appointed in power by, guess who? Caesar himself. So the Herodians are sent there sort of as this like Roman witnesses. Like if Jesus says, no, you shouldn't pay this tax, then the Herodians are there to catch him in the act. So this is a trap. It's quite the trap too. Like what is Jesus going to do? How does he answer? Well, his answer is actually brilliant. In verse 20 says, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's, obviously. And then he said to them, therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. See, when Jesus responds, he actually asks two questions with one question. He says, whose likeness is this? And whose inscription is this? And then in one answer, he answers both questions. He's saying that Caesar's likeness, Caesar's face is on the coin. Therefore, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Give him his coin back. It is literally his. It has his face on it. It was minted out of his own wealth. Give him his coin back. But the inscription, the one that says Tiberius, son of God, high priest, that is not Caesar's. The inscription is God's. Therefore, render to God the things that are God's. Jesus is saying, render to Caesar the coin, but render to God the inscription. He's saying, you may give Caesar back his coin, but you may not give Caesar your worship. Your worship belongs to God and God alone. Right? It's a brilliant answer. Like Jesus is so much smarter than them, and they had no idea. In one answer, Jesus says that you can pay your taxes and worship God at the same time. Say that again. Jesus says you should pay your taxes. It just happens to be tax season. This message is not sponsored by the IRS. All right, it's sponsored by the Word of God. Anyways, once Jesus utters this brilliant answer, the Pharisees realize that they've failed. They've failed to trap him. They believe that if they could just get this guy Jesus ensnared in this political debate about the poll tax, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn around to everyone standing there, turn around to the rest of the crowd and say, look, see, he's not the Christ, he's a politician. He has not come to be the Christ to us. He's come to be a politician to us. He doesn't care about the things of God. He doesn't care about the scriptures. He doesn't have things to say, bless you. He doesn't have things to say about the way that you should live your life. He just has political opinions to give. He just wants to tell you what your politics should be. If the Pharisees had their way, they would much rather Jesus just be a politician. Because if that's all that he is, if Jesus is just a politician, then why would they or anyone else ever submit to him as their God? But what Jesus has shown them is, one, he's way smarter than they are. But two, he is uninterested in being just a politician to them. No, Jesus is uninterested in being anything other than the Christ to them. Jesus is the potter who has come to shape the clay. But the Pharisees, they do everything in their power to remain the dry and hard clay. They will not budge. See, they believe that if they can just paint Jesus as this politician of the world, then Jesus can just fit nicely into the plan that they already have for their lives, and they won't have to change. But the reality is, Jesus has come not to be just a politician. He has come to be the Christ. But the attempts to silence Jesus as the Christ don't stop there. Look at what happens next in verse 23. It says, the same day Sadducees came to him, who say that there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, you are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. So enter the Sadducees. All right, the Sadducees, like the Pharisees, they're some of the religious leaders of the time, but they're actually really different from the Pharisees. See, the Pharisees are kind of like today, the more like theologically conservative, fundamentalist church, a group of people that are like, let's just focus on doing all the right things. But the Sadducees, you can liken them to more like religious, progressive, liberal scholars. See, they did believe in God. They believed in sort of this, but they believed in this sort of like stripped down, non-supernatural version of the faith. They basically said, yeah, we can get on board with this whole God thing, but all that stuff about the miracles and everything supernatural, yeah, there's just no way that stuff is real. For one thing, they didn't believe in the whole Old Testament. They believed in just the first 5 books of the Bible or the Torah. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe that there was this coming judgment day and a whole host of other things. But most importantly, they did not believe that there was a Messiah coming. They did not believe that there was a Christ coming. So when Jesus shows up on the scene and claims to be the Christ, this is a huge problem for them. So they will try, like the Pharisees, to do what they can to discredit this man. So what do? Well, they ask Jesus a question as well, but they ask a question about a doctrine that not only they think is false, but they think it's dumb. The doctrine they think is dumb is the idea of heaven. The idea that there is an afterlife in heaven. Back in verse 23, they said, the same day the Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection. Now don't get confused. The resurrection that it's talking about here is not like the resurrection of Jesus. That hasn't even happened yet. When they say resurrection here, what it means is life after death, specifically in heaven. But not only, remember, that do they not believe in heaven, but they think it's dumb. They're like, why would you ever believe in this place that you can't see? So what they do is they come up with this hypothetical question that is designed to not only make the resurrection look dumb, but make Jesus look dumb. Because if Jesus answers their question yes, then they believe he will look stupid. He will look dumb. So in their question, what does Sadducees do? They reference this Old Testament institution called levirate marriage. And we're not really going to get super deep into this. I know it's probably confusing as we were reading it. You can go read more about it in Deuteronomy 25 if you want to. But it was actually this really merciful way of caring for widows in the Mosaic law. See, in ancient times, if a woman's husband died and she had no children to care for her, she was actually in like a really terrible situation because families would often just like abandon them. Families would leave them out to starve on the street. In this kind of patriarchal culture, she couldn't just like go out and get a job. And she was also really unlikely to find someone else who'd be willing to marry her and care for her in this kind of culture. So by instituting this levirate marriage, Moses tells these families, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to just leave this woman out to starve. You may not just leave her out on the street. I'm going to force you to take care of her. So the brother of the husband who died must marry the widow and make sure that she's taken care of for the rest of her life. You're not going to leave her out on the street. It was this merciful way of making sure that widows were cared for in ancient times. But what the Sadducees do in their question is they take this merciful way of caring for widows and they twist it. They twist it into this hypothetical situation that's designed to try and make the resurrection look dumb and make Jesus look dumb. They say, okay, Jesus, if a woman's husband dies and then the brother-in-law marries her, what if he dies and it happens again and then he dies and he dies and he dies and he dies? All of a sudden, she's had 7 husbands in the resurrection in heaven. Whose husband is going to be with her? They're like, this is so dumb. This idea of heaven is so dumb. How do you figure that question out, Jesus? They want to make the idea of heaven look so foolish that if Jesus answers their question at all and actually affirms this idea of heaven, he'll look dumb. But Jesus, remember, he's way smarter than they are. Jesus is anything but foolish. Jesus gives another brilliant answer. He says, all right, Sadducees, I'll answer your question, but the answer is, you don't understand what heaven is. Jesus says there is no marriage in heaven. Okay, pause. I realize maybe like a bomb just went off in your mind. Maybe you're like me and you're like, I don't know if I like that. I don't know if I like the idea of there not being marriage in heaven. I love my marriage. I love my wife, Janelle. Or maybe you're like, I love my husband. I don't want that to end when I get to heaven. That's kind of sad. Well, trust me, I get it. But listen, the Bible makes it clear that heaven is going to be the most wonderful place imaginable. And even though it may be hard to believe, apparently, heaven without marriage will still be infinitely better than earth with marriage. Heaven without marriage will be way better than earth with marriage because we will be with God. The human marriage on earth, though it's amazing, is a foreshadowing of the final marriage that will take place, the final and ultimate marriage where Jesus and his bride, the church, will finally be together forever. We'll be with God in heaven for eternity. So Jesus says, no, Sadducees, there won't be marriage in heaven. It'll be way better. It'll be way better than that. And he doesn't stop there. Then he says, not only are you misunderstanding what heaven is like, but if you're going to maintain this idea that there is no heaven at all, you should take a closer look at the scriptures that you say you believe in. Remember, they believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, which includes Exodus. So Jesus goes back to Exodus and he says, do you remember? Don't you remember what God said to Moses in the burning bush? He said, I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I am. Because all 3 of them were still alive in heaven with God. So Jesus answers their question again with 2 answers, but he answers brilliantly. But did you notice that that's not all Jesus did? What's the first thing that he said? He said, before he answered their question, he said, Sadducees, you are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Jesus says, I'll answer your question, Sadducees, because I'm not afraid of it. But before I do that, here's what's really going on. You have already decided in your heart that the scriptures aren't true and God's power isn't real. See, they tried with all their might to discredit Jesus and prove to themselves and everyone standing there that the reason they could not trust this man was because they had a question that they felt like was unanswerable and made the afterlife look dumb. But they were using their question as a mask to hide what was really going on in their hearts. So Jesus is willing to answer their question, but apparently what he's most interested is in what's underneath the question. He's most interested in what is going on in their hearts. Treeline, do you have a question that because you feel like it's unanswered, you can't trust God? Do you have a question like that? I do. I had this friend named Blake who he was a close friend of mine, and we worked together in ministry for a few years. And 2 months ago, he woke up in the morning, and suddenly a brain aneurysm that nobody knew about ruptured in his head. And he was immediately taken to the hospital, and then shortly after, he was declared brain dead. And they kept his body alive for a few days because they kept his heart beating because they were waiting on these organ donation recipients to be identified and all that process. And then, surrounded by his loving family, they took him off life support, and he went to go be with Jesus. And as he left and went to go be with Jesus, he left behind his adoring wife and their unborn child. He was 26. Of course, I have questions about that. Of course I do. I have questions like, why Blake? Why a man who was 26 years old? Why a man with an adoring wife? Why a man with an unborn child who will now never know their father? Those are my questions. What are your questions? What is the question that you feel like sits in your heart constantly that you have for God that feels like it's unanswered? Is your question, why am I 40 years old and still single? Is your question, why are we unable to conceive a child? Is your question, why do I feel like I have no friends? Is your question, why am I still, after all this time, addicted to this? Treeline, if you have a question like that, first, you need to know that you're in good company. Not only do we welcome people with all kinds of questions at Treeline, but we have questions like that ourselves. We're working hard to be the kind of church where if someone has a genuine question that they're wrestling with, we don't say to them, well, I guess you should just have more faith. Our church isn't afraid of questions because apparently Jesus wasn't. Jesus wasn't afraid of questions. We should be honest about the questions that we have and bring them to Jesus. He wants to sit with you in your questions. And I don't know if you will get the answers that you're seeking, but one thing is certain, your question will not make Jesus turn away. Jesus leans in to the people with questions, and he doesn't lean away from them. So bring your questions to Jesus. But be careful that you don't do what the Sadducees do. Be careful that you don't ask your question with the heart posture of a Sadducee. See, what this encounter that Jesus has with the Sadducees, I think what it cautions us against is using our questions sort of as a mask to hide what's really going on in your heart. See, the Sadducees say that the reason that they can't trust Jesus is because of the questions they have. But what's really going on, and Jesus knows this, is they just don't want him. They just don't want Jesus. They are the hard clay that refuses to be shaped by the potter. Instead of trusting Jesus as their Christ, the Sadducees try to make him look dumb and create for themselves an excuse not to yield to him as their king. But they failed because Jesus is the Christ. So that's 2 attempts now. The religious leaders mounted to try and use questions to prove that Jesus, this man, was not the Christ. But both have failed. So they're going to try one last time. Look what happens in verse 34. It says, but then the Pharisees heard that they had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. The Pharisees, they come back together and they say, okay, we've tried to make him look like a politician, but we failed. And the Sadducees tried to make him look dumb, and they utterly failed. Let's try one last thing. Let's try and make it look like he's just another one of us, another one of these teachers that's come to teach the law and teach the right things to do, just like we are. Let's ask him which commandment he thinks is the most important. Because then, once he gives his answer, we can turn around to the crowds and say, see? He's just another guy that's come to tell us the right things to do. He doesn't care about anything else. He just wants to tell you the right things that you should do. But then Jesus, like he has this entire time, he answers brilliant. He says, well, the most important commandments are love God fully and love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sure that just when the Pharisees were about to say, finally, we got him, he answered the question the way we wanted him to. He says, oh, and by the way, on these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets. That word depend, the Greek word literally means to hang, to be suspended in mid-air by something. Jesus is saying that the entire weight of the law actually hangs on whether or not you fully love God and love your neighbor 100% of the time. And if you don't, then the entire weight of the law will fall because it hangs on these two commandments. If you fail even once, it falls. And you can try your very best, Pharisees, but you will fail to do this. See, Jesus isn't interested, though he does tell them which commandments are the greatest, he isn't actually interested in telling them which laws that they should focus on keeping. He's trying to show them that no matter how hard they try, they cannot keep the law. Jesus wants them to see that they don't need actually another teacher to come and point them to the right laws, the right things to do. They need a Christ who can save them from their failure to keep the law. So once again, Jesus has shown them that he's uninterested in being anything other than the Christ to them. He is not just another moral teacher. He is the Savior of moral failures. But they are still this dry and hard clay that will not budge. It refuses to be changed by the hands of the potter. So now Jesus is finished answering their questions, and he says, all right, now it's my turn. Look what happens in verse 41. It says, now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, well, the son of David. He said to them, how is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So now Jesus turns to them and asks them a question of his own, and he quotes Psalm 110, which would have been well known by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. See, the Pharisees knew and believed that Psalm 110 was written long ago by King David about the Messiah, the Christ. But they believed that this Christ was just going to be another military and political leader from the line of David. But Jesus points something out to them that they have been missing this entire time. He points out to them, didn't you see? Didn't you read? David calls this descendant of his Lord. In these times, there is no way that that could mean anything other than he's referring to God. Jesus is pointing out to them that all this time, they have been missing the fact that the Messiah was going to be so much more than a political and military leader. The Messiah was going to be the only one who David would ever actually call his Lord, God himself. And he wants them to see that the reason that they have missed this is not because they didn't see it. It's been there the whole time. The reason they missed it was because they didn't want to see it. It was there all along. Jesus wants them to see that their problem is not just that they can't see that the Christ has come, but they do not want to acknowledge that he has come. They try and make every excuse in the book with their questions in order to evade this reality that the Christ has come, because they are just too in love with the way that things are. They would love for this Jesus guy to be just this sort of lesser version of himself that fits nicely into their lives, where they can just continue about their business as usual. They would love for Jesus to be someone that he's not. They would much rather him be a politician. They would much rather him just be another teacher. They want to be able to say to Jesus, you may be a good moral teacher to us, but you may not be God to us. You may speak into this part of our lives, but you may not have authority over all of our lives. Because if you have authority over all of our lives, then what that means is we don't. And there is room for only one on the throne of our lives, and that seat is already taken. See, Jesus is the potter that has sat down at his shop, and instead of finding soft clay that's ready for him to carefully shape and mold into something beautiful, he's sat down in front of dry, hard clay that resists his hands. Treeline, if Jesus walked in this room, if he just walked in the back and he sat down with us, what kind of clay would he find? Would he find hard, dry clay, or would he find soft clay? That state of being like hard clay, does that sound familiar to you? It does to me. See, there's this part of me that wants to believe that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, like they're so other, like they're so different from me. But the truth is, they're not. There is a huge part of me that would love a version of Jesus that just sort of fits nicely into my life, the plan that I already have for my life. And as much as I hate to admit it, there are so many times when I would much rather just have a different version of Jesus altogether. One that fits nicely into my life and isn't the king over my life. I want to be the one who has the final say. Like, I want to be the one who is Lord over everything in my life. And I would much rather Jesus be the sort of consultant. I want to be the one who has the final say in where I live, how I spend my time, how I spend my money, all of it. There are moments where I resist and I try and get back on the throne where there is only room for one. There are so many moments where I try and be the hard and dry clay. But listen, the hope for me and the hope for you lies in who the potter is. He is not an amateur potter. He knows how to make the hard clay soft again. And how does a potter make hard clay soft clay again? What's the only way to take dry, hard clay and turn it back into something that is ready to be shaped again? You need water. And what is the water that Jesus has come to bring in order to make the hard clay soft again? His empty tomb. Listen, it was not a surprise to Jesus that when he walked into Jerusalem, people wanted him dead. In the last week of his life, Jesus, he intentionally and continuously leaned into the very people that wanted him dead. He knew exactly what he was doing. He came to die willingly. His life was not going to be taken from him. He came to give his life. But then he didn't stay dead. 3 days later, he rose from his tomb that they laid him in, and he proved once and for all that he was all along who he said he was. Jesus was, and always will be the Christ. The clay does not have to resist the hands of the potter any longer. Jesus walked out of his tomb and proved that he is who he says he is. He is the Christ. Treeline, Jesus has come to make something beautiful out of our clay. Would we let him? Would we let him add his water to our clay so that we can be soft again? He wants to make something beautiful out of us. But I want to close with this question. What would it look like if you truly lived like Jesus is the Christ? Like if you really lived like it? If he was the king over your life and not just a consultant? How would you spend your money? How would you raise your kids? Where would you move to? Where would you stay and be faithful to for a long time? What job offer would you take? What job offer would you turn down? What friend would you forgive? Whose burdens would you bear? What neighbor would you finally get the courage to share the gospel with? What would your life look like? What would our lives look like if the first thing that we did every morning was decide in our hearts and preach to ourselves, Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is my King. And then we went and we lived like it. That would be awesome. My hope is that we actually grow into that kind of people together.